Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video, and we are going to visit for the first time Cynical Historian. You guys have been suggesting him to me for months, especially in light of my recent love for Woodrow Wilson on the channel. I guess he's somebody who hates him about as much as I do, but I thought I would take a look at, I was looking over all of his videos, and I haven't really watched any of his stuff yet. A few of you have suggested that some of it might make my head explode, but we're not going to get into any of those today. Or maybe we are. I don't know. This one's called American Presidential Tyranny, featuring The Exploration with Will Fox. So we're going to check this out. I don't know what it's about. I could guess that he's probably going to talk about John Adams, Woodrow Wilson, Andrew Jackson, maybe Abraham Lincoln. I don't know. Some of the examples that people usually use. So I don't know. We'll see. And at the end, stick around. I want to tell you about the latest video over on VTH Extra. But I'll save that for the end. Let's dive in. I like the intro.
Hey, Cypher here, and before we get started, I want to mention that this episode is being done in conjunction with Will from The Exploration. We wanted to talk about how representative democracy can be subverted or turned into tyranny, a pretty apt subject at any time. It is always a pressing matter. So I'm going to be looking at America, whereas he is looking at Germany.
Our goal in this collaboration isn't to induce panic or draw false parallels. Tyranny and authoritarianism come in many forms and develop differently. What we want to achieve with our two videos is not to provide absolute answers, but rather to facilitate a larger and more mature conversation about authoritarianism.
All right, fair enough.
Here in the United States, we have a very clear way of defining tyranny within our government, yet somehow it's vague as well. Since our Constitution was created in 1787, usurping that Constitution has been the easiest way to proclaim someone as a tyrant. But defining what is and isn't against the Constitution is left up to one branch of government, the judiciary. Yet they kind of just granted it to themselves. There is no provision in Article 3 of the Constitution that states that the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review.
That's a really great point. Honestly, one of the greatest acts of tyranny you could argue in our nation's history was the Supreme Court granting itself the power of judicial review. I think that goes back to Marbury versus Madison, I think was the case. Where, yeah, basically the court just said, we get to decide these things. And for the last 200 years, we've operated that way. And nobody ever really challenged it or questioned it. And so many court cases, so many of the biggest decisions in American history, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education, Roe versus Wade, were decided by a court who just gave itself the power to decide what was a constitutional law and what wasn't. So, interesting point he makes.
Yet, in 1803, they proclaimed they did. The power of judicial review is taken for granted today, but many anti-federalists called it tyranny even then. Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time, even said the court's members would become despots. So even the idea of constitutionality is founded in scandal.
Now, it's important to note that when, he's talking here about, I see the thing pop up about separation of powers. There is a way to deal with judicial tyranny. You could impeach judges the same way you can impeach a president. It's very difficult to do, as it should be. And these days it would be next to impossible to do because you're never going to get 2/3 of the Senate to vote to impeach somebody, because you're always going to have a good bit of the Senate who supports whatever decision they make because we become so polarized.
Every branch has its fair share of tyrannical history, so let's narrow it down to the easiest to construe, the executive branch. Various presidents have committed acts of tyranny. Some were ruled against, others blinded the Supreme Court because of wartime. So let's look at a few of those specific cases over time. The first and most obvious case of presidential tyranny was during the Adams administration of 1797 to 1801. Because of the quasi-war, an actual naval war we fought against France over a diplomatic scandal called the XYZ affair, and because of fears of the reign of terror in France spreading across the Atlantic, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts.
So at the time this is going on, John Adams is the president, Thomas Jefferson is the vice president, and this is in the early part of our history. Whoever came in first in electoral votes was the president. Whoever came in second was the vice president. If we still had that same system today, right now you would have President Joe Biden and Vice President Donald Trump. Before that, you would have had President Donald Trump and Vice President Hillary Clinton. They changed it during Jefferson's administration after he had Aaron Burr as his vice president when they had a really contentious election that ended in a tie. But up until that time, that's the way it was. And so Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were polar opposites when it came to how they viewed government. And this was a big thing at the time because it was really a political issue here at home, the issue about what to do with France. Jefferson was very, very pro-France. He had been the ambassador to France. He was there when the French Revolution broke out, helped Marquis de Lafayette draft basically what was kind of the French version of the Declaration of Independence before coming back home to America to become the Secretary of State. And all along during Washington's administration, he's very pro-France. And then the same thing happens under Adams. And so when Adams goes along with these Alien and Sedition Acts, Jefferson hated it. And, it became a domestic political issue as well as being a foreign policy issue.
With Adams happily signing it into law. They made it a longer process to naturalize to being an American citizen, and gave the ability to deport aliens of a supposedly hostile country for whatever reason, or any alien who even vaguely scared a government official.
So, kind of the reasoning behind this was that the French government, including, I think, the French ambassador to the United States, were pretty openly inciting American citizens to demonstrate in the streets their pro-France viewpoints. Remember, France had been our strongest ally during the American Revolution. There is no United States without French support during the Revolution. They were vital. Yorktown only happens because of the French Navy and the French Army being there, and French guns, French money. There were other allies as well, but the French by far the most important. And so when then France goes through its own revolution and starts going to war with other nations in Europe, and the United States stays neutral, this upset a lot of Americans. And so there was a lot of kind of upheaval going on at home, and this was their answer to try and deal with that. Was it the right way to deal with it? No, but that was kind of the thought process.
Then even for citizens, the Sedition Act made it a criminal offense for uttering or publishing any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States.
Which is amazing to me that many of these same people who are in Congress at this point, who passed this law, were the same ones who just 20 years earlier were railing against the tyranny of King George III. How quickly they forgot and how quickly they became that which they despised.
This became hilariously bad. One guy, during a parade, heard a shot fired and proclaimed, "I hope it hit Adams in the arse." He was fined for the joke. Others were not so jovial. Several people were jailed, one even dying while awaiting trial.
So Benjamin Franklin Bache is the grandson of Benjamin Franklin. And that's a little misleading. He died in, I think, a yellow fever pandemic that hit Philadelphia. So his death, he was only like in his late 20s. His death really had nothing to do with that. James Callender, you've probably heard me talk about before. He may be the original Epstein. James Callender was Thomas Jefferson's political hatchet man. When Jefferson was Secretary of State, Callender was hired by the State Department as a translator, but he couldn't translate anything. What he actually was doing was being paid on the government payroll, on the State Department payroll, but he was secretly, he was running an administration newspaper service. He was trashing the administration that Jefferson was a part of at Jefferson's behest. It was James Callender who first finds out and leaks the story about Alexander Hamilton's sex scandal. And when Thomas Jefferson becomes president, Callender is all set to testify in court that Jefferson paid him to do all this stuff. And then he shows up dead in like 3 feet of water in Virginia right before the trial. Really, really suspicious circumstances.
The first person prosecuted under these laws was a congressman named Matthew Leon. Funny enough, he was reelected to Congress while he was still in jail. How do you get reelected from a jail cell? When he got out, he went right back to Congress to fight against these laws. The newly formed Democratic-Republican Party...
Oh, there's Aaron Burr right there on the right. Democratic Republicans. Aaron Burr was whatever party suited his needs in any given moment. He ends up vice president, but there was no chance he was going to stay vice president. Thomas Jefferson was already looking elsewhere, and so Burr runs for governor of New York and loses that while he's vice president. And it's that election for governor that kind of indirectly leads to the duel with Alexander Hamilton. And so you have the sitting vice president of the United States murdering the former Secretary of the Treasury, one of our founding fathers, and then he gets away with it.
Made it their sticking point to end these acts, so the election turned ugly.
Fight!
John Adams has a hideous hermaphroditic character, which has neither the force and firmness of a man, nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman.
You think politics are bad now? Some of the stuff that they were saying about each other, the difference was back then they would use pen names and pseudonyms. They wouldn't use their own names to do this stuff. They would hire other people to do it for them.
Vice President Jefferson is a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian squaw, sired by a Virginia mulatto father.
Finish him!
And Adams was defeated. They repealed the sedition part, but modified the Alien Acts
still in the
or
books.
let them expire. In fact, the Alien Enemies Act is still the law, despite its sordid past. But you'll see this specter of tyranny remains throughout American history. And remember, it was for a smaller war than we're waging today. Now, that wasn't challenged by the Supreme Court. In fact, the court hadn't started using judicial review yet, but this next one was quite the opposite. Andrew Jackson was never free of controversy, but the worst was the Indian Removal Act. In the original boundaries of the US, the American Indian presence had been a source of concern for the early government. Even before the Constitution, there had been continuous wars with them. The federal government had acted in good faith in trying to respect their land claims, but also sought to remove them if possible. So the Calhoun Plan was an attempt to buy Indian land, which was implemented during President Monroe's time until the 1830s, about 15 years. But Jackson pushed a different agenda. Having fought the Creeks in the War of 1812 and the First Seminole War, and being a Southerner who had what were called the 5 civilized tribes to contend with.
So they're called the 5 civilized tribes because, well, I mean, according to European viewpoint, they were civilized. They had government. They dressed much like Europeans did. Many of them spoke English. They even had a constitution. They were, I mean, from that viewpoint, a civilized tribe.
He had a less, shall we say, civilized way of dealing with them.
Yeah.
He wanted to move them all to a small batch of land that would come to be called Indian Territory and eventually become Oklahoma. The act that was promulgated in 1830 doesn't sound particularly troubling, with things like, it shall be lawful for the president to cause such a tribe or nation to be protected, and to have the same superintendence and care over any tribe or nation, provided that nothing in this act contained shall be construed as authorizing or directing the violation of existing treaties. It sounds downright humanitarian.
But this is why you have to have a judiciary that can interpret things like that, because otherwise whoever's carrying that law out, the executive, is going to interpret it however they want to, and that's what Jackson does. He's like, well, I read that to mean that, you know, sending them to Oklahoma, sending them to Indian Territory, that is protecting them. That is keeping with the treaty. they probably wouldn't see it that way, and the government, the Supreme Court's not going to see it that way, but everybody has their own interpretation, and that's still going on today. People take amendments and laws that were never intended to be used for a particular issue, and they interpret it to mean that issue because it's just a way of getting what they want.
The basic idea was that they would provide money and supplies in exchange for these tribes to relocate themselves into Indian territory. Unfortunately, that was not the real intent. Congressmen saw through the fluffy language, and many voted against it. In the House, it was decided by 101 to 97, a pretty narrow margin. The new treaties signed by these tribes to instate the relocation were not representative of most tribes as a whole, or were not ratified by their tribal organizations. Some tribes did go willingly, like the Choctaw, but most did not. The Cherokee were pretty adamant, and the Supreme Court even ruled that individual states like Georgia had no authority over them. This infuriated Jackson, who stated, "The decision of the Supreme Court has fell stillborn, and they find that they cannot coerce Georgia to yield to its mandate," which has been...
So remember, Andrew Jackson, like most Southerners at this time, is very pro states' rights, very pro weaker federal government. In the South at this time, they're dealing, with things like there's going to be something called the nullification crisis, which is where the states feel they have the right to just ignore any federal laws that they don't want to go along with. And so that's, Jackson in this case is saying, hey, they can't force Georgia to do what they're trying to do. Well, good for Georgia.
More popularly rendered as, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." By 1835, all the treaties had been signed, and full-on removal was taking place, often under horrendous conditions, called the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee Treaty was definitely bogus, representing a clear violation of that 1832 ruling. The tyranny here is that Jackson refused to be bound by the letter of the law specifically ruled by the Supreme Court, resulting in thousands of dead Indians.
And that poses a great question. So, what if the Supreme Court issues a ruling and the president and the federal government just say, so what? And then they do what they want anyway. That's what happens here. And the Supreme Court really doesn't have any way of forcing them to do that. And if you've got the legislative branch on your side, you're safe. It's not like they're going to impeach you and remove you from office. So there's really... the Supreme Court in that situation becomes completely powerless to do anything to enforce that law.
With other tribes, though, it's not so clear. For instance, the Seminoles fought a war to not be removed, but only because they broke the treaty they had fully ratified 2 years prior. So it's not as black and white if you don't focus solely on the Cherokee. Now, I could go on and on about the nuances of U.S.-Indian relations and how presidents often resort to tyranny, but the Trail of Tears will have to suffice here. Instead, let's look at one of America's most beloved presidents, Abraham Lincoln. I've seen some folks in the comments who were hateful of Lincoln, but normally because of foolish or unspecified reasons. But his suspension of habeas corpus is one thing that can be called tyrannical. You see, the Constitution does grant the right to suspend habeas corpus.
I tell people this constantly. I get so many people commenting to me, telling me, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. He was a tyrant. No. It's in the Constitution. Lincoln had the full right to do that. You can suspend habeas corpus, which I think basically in Latin means produce the body, have a body. It just is the right to know what you're being charged, to be charged with a crime. You can't be just held in prison without being charged with something and put on trial. But it can be suspended in cases of rebellion or invasion. The public safety may require it. There's a rebellion going on.
Corpus. But to Congress, not the president. Lincoln suspended it to arrest a bunch of people he considered to be secessionists in Maryland after the Baltimore riot, including most of Baltimore's government and a third of Maryland's General Assembly, all without trial or even a charge. Heck, the grandson of Francis Scott Key was imprisoned in the very ramparts his grandfather wrote about in the Star-Spangled Banner.
Kind of ironic.
Now that's irony. The Supreme Court ruled this was unconstitutional, but Lincoln carried on with it anyways.
Another situation. Now that that you can argue Lincoln was tyrannical by ignoring the courts in that case. Again, what's the Supreme Court going to do? Lincoln's got a couple million-man army. He's fighting a war. His party's in power. He's not going anywhere. And he knew that.
He stopped for about 8 months after the Civil War was in full swing, but did it again to militiamen who were forming to join the Confederacy. With habeas corpus suspended, there was no means of getting these guys out of jail short of insurrection. But with a war raging, what are you gonna do? Now, I've got to say, the people saying Lincoln acted tyrannically by leaving garrisons in the South, like Portsmouth or Sumter, are very incorrect. There is absolutely nothing unconstitutional in that, nor was it Lincoln who ordered it. That was Buchanan. Lincoln simply used the positioning of those garrisons to the Union's diplomatic advantage.
Yeah, it was a way of forcing the Confederacy into a decision. What are you going to do? You're going to leave a federal fort right off your coast, a bunch of federal forts, or are you going to fire on them and then it'll be you who have fired the first shot? And Lincoln understood that. He set it up that way in his first inaugural address. He said, it is in your hands, the momentous issue of civil war, and not in mine. He said, we will not be the aggressors. He always intended that if there would be a war, the South would fire the first shot.
He did have some serious failings when it came to Indian policy, including some very real tyranny, such as his handling of various massacres that happened during the Civil War, but not when dealing with the Confederacy.
And the largest execution, mass execution, took place in American history during Lincoln's administration. A bunch of Native Americans who were, I think it was up in Minnesota, this took place. And Lincoln's not unique in that. I mean, pretty much every president, much like the fact that most presidents in the first 80 years of our nation's history did not necessarily handle the slavery issue very well. Lincoln is one of a string of presidents who do not handle the Native American issues very well at all.
So the suspension of habeas corpus may be a fairly minor thing in terms of Lincoln's presidency, but the next guy's tyranny is an overriding part
Woodrow
of
Wilson.
his presidency. And if you've been watching this channel, you know who's coming next.
Oh yeah, it's gotta be. I love it.
Woodrow Wilson did several things in his presidency that may easily be construed as tyrannical.
Yep.
His implementation of Jim Crow segregation in the federal workforce, the usurping of Congress in allowing banks to loan to the Allies, and thereby bring the U.S. closer to joining a side in World War I.
Yeah, the argument that we were neutral in the Great War is ridiculous. We were funding the Allies. We were sending supplies to the Allies, but not to the Germans. And this is one of the things that has always bothered me about our claim of neutrality. Especially then our indignance at unrestricted submarine warfare by the Germans. The unrestricted submarine warfare was basically the German version of the Allied blockade. The Allies had blockaded any supplies, food, things like that from being sent to the Central Powers. Something like close to 1 million German civilians died as a result of that blockade. Far more civilians died as a result of the Allied blockade than died as a result of the German unrestricted submarine warfare. But to the victor goes the history to be written. And so the Americans were never neutral in this war. It was always pro-Allies.
And of course, his long-term wars beyond the realm of the minor interventions of previous presidents without congressional approval. But there's a much more obvious case than all of that, and it is the Espionage and Sedition Acts.
Basically, his Alien and Sedition Acts. Same thing, wartime, a justification for jailing all of your political rivals, things like that.
The Sedition Act is really just a rehash of what John Adams signed into law back in the 1790s, wrought again to punish anyone who spoke out against World War I. If you spoke ill of it, then you could endanger recruitment possibilities. Funny enough, this was actually ruled on by the Supreme Court, but they actually thought it was constitutional. This is where we get the term clear and present danger, because distributing flyers that argue against the war to possible recruits was apparently not protected speech. This got further reinforced by the court, expanding it to not just World War I, but to supposed Bolshevik campaigning against the Russian intervention. In the dissenting opinion of that one, we got the whole marketplace of ideas quote. This would probably be ruled unconstitutional today, but the court was swayed by the Red Scare. In either case, the Espionage Act is still on the books, though modified to not be as bad. Many information leakers face prosecution from the act today, but normally don't end up spending much time, if any, in prison. So, to get off of Wilson, whom I'm already dedicating a couple episodes to, let's move on to the next World War. Of course, in between the wars, there was this guy who rose to power in another democracy. You might have heard of him. He's still the poster child for tyranny.
But I'll leave that one up to Will.
Be sure to go check out his channel, and come back here because the last tyrannical president on the list is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR was president longer than any other, so we can forgive him for having more than the normal amount of scandals throughout his presidency.
And I've heard people argue that in and of itself was tyrannical, the fact that he ran for 4 terms, but there was nothing that legally bound a person to only 2 terms in office. That was simply everyone following a tradition started by George Washington, and there were presidents who attempted, like Ulysses S. Grant, for example, did try to run for a 3rd term. He didn't get the nomination, but he did try to run for a 3rd term, or at least kind of flirted with the idea. Theodore Roosevelt had served almost all of William McKinley's term, got elected to his own term, and then came back 4 years after he left office and tried to run again. FDR was just the first one that did it successfully, and then they immediately passed the constitutional amendment to make sure it couldn't happen again.
The New Deal was pretty polarizing, but it is what he did during World War II that is clearly tyranny. After the attacks on Pearl Harbor, there was great fear of Japanese people in the States. There were known spy rings in Hawaii before the war, but somehow the fear really only applied stateside. Hawaii wasn't a state yet. The magic machine intercepts also indicated there was some sort of spy activity. Then there were a few incidents that cast doubt on Japanese loyalty in FDR's mind. First was the Ni-Hao incident, where some local Japanese Americans helped a downed fighter pilot who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attacks. Then there were Japanese attacks on the mainland and Aleutian Islands. They took over a few islands and bombarded a few places in California and Oregon. But by the time those had happened, the War Department was already planning on what to do with any Japanese people within the United States. FDR had branded all Italians, Germans, and Japanese as enemy aliens before Germany even declared war on the US. But there wasn't as much proof of German and Italian collusion with the enemy. So,
and let's be honest here, and you guys, you know me, I'm very, very hesitant to talk about race being a motivation for things. I think that racism gets thrown out way more often than it should, and it belittles the fact that there is real racism. I think when you just hurl that at anybody who disagrees with somebody, it's very dangerous and damaging because it ends up making people cry wolf, and so then we ignore when real racism exists. But let's be honest here. There's definitely something to be said for the way Japanese Americans were dealt with versus the way Italian and German Americans were dealt with, who were Europeans. And part of this, too, goes to how the Japanese were fighting the war. Some of that was earned by the Japanese government. It's not fair to the Japanese Americans, but the way the Japanese fought, the way they treated prisoners of war, the way they treated civilians, things like that, caused people to think a certain way about Japanese people because they didn't know that the Germans were doing the same thing to Jews and others. But yeah, I mean, but let me say this. Isn't it interesting that one of the most decorated units in the U.S. Army during the Second World War, the 442nd Combat Team, fighting in Europe with Japanese Americans? Just like in the First World War, one of the most significantly impactful units was the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, who were black Americans who couldn't even be treated as equal in their own country, but go over and fight better than just about anybody in the war. Same thing is true with Japanese Americans fighting in Europe during World War II, despite the fact that if they were back home, they might have been thrown into a camp.
FDR felt justified in taking the next step against the Japanese. Perhaps tellingly, Canada preempted him by requiring their people of Japanese descent to relocate east of the Rockies. 3 weeks later, FDR issued the infamous Executive Order 9066.
The time has come. Execute Order 66.
And it's not just that scene. I mean, there's so much of Star Wars that is directly connected to the events of World War II and how the Nazis rose to power, things like that.
They began sending people of Japanese descent to internment camps, where they were excluded from possibly spying on the American war effort. These camps were only instituted stateside, and were not supposed to be like prison camps. They had full amenities, but that doesn't change the fact that they were forced out of their own homes because there were a few spies among tens of thousands.
Their evacuation did not imply individual disloyalty, but was ordered to reduce a military hazard at a time when danger of invasion was great. Americanism, taught in the schools and churches and on the playgrounds, loses much of its meaning in the confines of a relocation center.
Or in realistic terms, because FDR couldn't see them as anything other than a race. Just like last time, the Supreme Court sided with the president on this one, despite 3 cases being brought up to fight this highly discriminatory policy.
So there can be no question of the constitutionality of any part of the action taken by the government to meet the dangers of war.
So, and this brings me to a larger topic about all of this. I get a lot of questions about why I argue that you can't judge a presidency in the immediate aftermath of that presidency. Why we need a long period of time to see how things play out, to let recency bias fade away, the emotions of our support for or against someone fade away. At the time, most people probably supported this. Supreme Court supported it. Now, I think just about everyone can look back and say this was terrible, it shouldn't have happened. But at the time, people didn't feel that way. It takes time, it takes separation from an event and taking the emotion out of it to be able to look back at it objectively and to be able to fairly judge it. That's why a lot of presidents in the immediate aftermath are judged differently than they are a generation or two later. When Dwight Eisenhower left office in 1961, he was ranked pretty low in presidents. He was ranked like 25th. And at the time, he was the 34th president. So he was ranked in like the bottom third of all presidents. Now he's consistently in the top 10, sometimes as high as 5th presidents of all time. But it wasn't seen that way at the time he left office. It takes time to see these things objectively.
So no law-abiding American need to fear for his own freedom.
The court issued a coram nobis in the 1980s saying Japanese internment was unconstitutional and reparations have been paid. Interestingly enough, Aleutian Islanders were also interned during the war to protect them from possible Japanese invasion, and they too have received restitution, but only decades later. So that's where I'm going to stop. World War II is a good breaking point, but you can see a bit of a pattern here. Tyranny in America is committed by violating the Constitution, and specifically the president by imprisoning people unconstitutionally. So if you want to look at current regimes for possible tyranny, first look at who they're putting in prison. So don't forget to check out Will from the Exploration if you haven't already.
All right, so we're going to stop it right there. Let me know your thoughts about all that. As always, please keep it to history, keep it to the topics we talked about. Don't go talking about stuff that happened in the last 5 or 10 years. I'll just delete the comment. I'm going to save you all the time of spending all your time to type out your well-thought-out rant because it's not going to stay there for everyone to see. Let's talk about history, though. Nothing recent. With that in mind, if you have other suggestions for other of Cypher's videos on the Cynical Historian you'd like me to do a reaction to, let me know that in the comment section below. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching. But wait, there's more. I almost forgot to tell you what I mentioned at the very beginning, which is if you have not checked out my new channel, VTH Extra, that's where all the non-historic stuff is going. So it's where I'll talk about sports. It's where I'm going to do stuff about music, maybe even do some of my original songs on there. It's where I'm going to share stories from my life. things that I've learned over the years. If that's something that interests you at all, check out my latest video. I'll put a couple of links up there to a couple of the newest videos that I did. This latest one, just sharing a couple of stories from my life. One was when I lost my best friend when I was 20 years old. And then, of course, more recently, losing my brother in the last year to COVID. And the lessons that I learned from those two significant losses in my life. Check it out. Thanks.